The moment someone humiliates you in public, you discover whether your greatest strength is your voice or your silence. I learned that lesson on the evening my wife chose to celebrate our 40th wedding anniversary by saying something that stopped every conversation in the room. My name is Ethan Walker. I was 68 years old, a retired civil engineer, and until that evening I believed I had already experienced every surprise life could offer. Our children had rented a beautiful banquet room at a country club outside Columbus, Ohio. Soft music floated through the air, while photographs from our 4 decades together appeared on large screens around the room. Friends, neighbors, former coworkers, and relatives filled nearly every table. There were fresh flowers, candles, and a cake decorated with the words celebrating 40 wonderful years. Looking around the room, I could not help smiling. 40 years had not been perfect, but they had been real. We had raised 2 children, survived financial hardships, cared for aging parents, celebrated graduations, welcomed grandchildren, and weathered every ordinary storm that life sends into a marriage. I knew there had been disappointments along the way, yet I believed respect had remained between us even when happiness sometimes faded. As guests greeted us, many asked for photographs. They congratulated us on reaching a milestone that fewer couples seemed to reach anymore. My wife, Victoria, smiled politely for every picture. She looked elegant in a dark emerald evening dress, and from a distance anyone would have believed we were the picture of a devoted couple. I had no reason to suspect the evening would become unforgettable for a completely different reason. During dinner, our daughter thanked everyone for coming and spoke warmly about growing up in our home. Our son shared a few humorous memories that made the room laugh. The atmosphere felt comfortable, almost peaceful. Then Victoria stood and reached for the microphone. I assumed she wanted to thank everyone for attending. Instead, she looked directly at me before turning toward the guests. Her voice was calm, almost casual, as though she were commenting on the weather. Then she said words I will never forget. I have been disgusted by you since our very first night together. Every fork stopped moving. Every conversation disappeared. The room became so quiet that I could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning above us. Several guests looked at me, expecting anger, confusion, or embarrassment. Others stared at Victoria, wondering whether they had heard her correctly. Our daughter slowly lowered her glass onto the table without making a sound. My grandson looked from one face to another, sensing that something serious had happened even though he could not understand the meaning. I felt dozens of eyes fixed on me, waiting for my reaction. In another season of my life, perhaps I would have defended myself immediately. Perhaps I would have demanded an explanation. But 40 years teaches a person many things, including the value of choosing the right moment instead of the fastest response. So I simply smiled. Not because her words did not hurt. They did. Not because I agreed with them. I certainly did not. I smiled because, for the first time in many years, I realized I no longer needed to prove my worth by arguing with someone determined to rewrite our history. That smile puzzled everyone in the room, especially Victoria. She expected shock. She expected anger. She expected me to defend myself before every guest sitting there. Instead, I quietly folded my hands on the table and looked at her with complete calm. Deep inside, memories from 40 years of marriage began returning one by one, and I knew that before this evening ended, the truth would finally have a chance to speak for itself. No one spoke after Victoria lowered the microphone. The silence stretched across the room with a weight that seemed impossible to measure. I could see questions on every face around me. Some guests looked embarrassed. Others looked uncomfortable. A few quietly stared at their plates, wishing they could disappear from the moment entirely. Our daughter looked at her mother with complete disbelief, while our son seemed frozen, unable to understand why an evening plan to celebrate 4 decades together had suddenly become something entirely different. I remained seated because there was nothing to gain from reacting in anger. My smile had never been intended to dismiss Victoria's words. It was simply the expression of a man who had finally stopped expecting appreciation from someone who had struggled to offer it for many years. As everyone waited for me to respond, my thoughts drifted backward through time. I remembered our first apartment, barely 600 square feet, with worn carpeting and a tiny kitchen where we laughed because the refrigerator door could not fully open without hitting the table. I remembered working long hours as a young engineer while taking evening certification classes so I could earn promotions that would provide a better future for our family. Victoria stayed home with our children during those early years, and I never doubted that we were building something meaningful together. Whenever money became tight, we found ways to manage. We postponed vacations, repaired old furniture instead of replacing it, and celebrated birthdays with homemade cakes instead of expensive parties. None of those sacrifices ever felt unfair because I believed we were making them together. As my career advanced, I accepted projects that required long drives across Ohio and neighboring states. Many mornings began before sunrise, and many evenings ended after dark. The work was demanding, but every paycheck represented another mortgage payment, another school expense, another opportunity for our children to pursue dreams that neither Victoria nor I had been able to afford when we were young. I rarely spoke about the pressure because I believed providing for my family was simply part of being a husband and father. When our daughter wanted to attend an out-of-state university, we made it happen. When our son dreamed of opening his own business, I quietly refinanced part of our home to help him secure his first loan. Neither decision felt like a burden. They felt like investments in the people I loved most. Looking back, I realized that many of the happiest memories in our family existed because someone had quietly carried responsibilities that nobody else noticed. I had never expected applause for those choices. Love is rarely measured by recognition. It is measured by consistency. Across the room, I noticed several longtime friends watching me carefully. They had known us for decades. They had attended birthday parties, holiday dinners, and family gatherings. If they were surprised by Victoria's statement, it was because they had seen only the surface of our marriage, just as most people had. They had seen photographs, anniversaries, vacations, and celebrations. They had not seen the quiet evenings when I chose silence instead of arguments because I believed protecting peace inside our home mattered more than winning disagreements. I slowly looked toward Victoria. She stood confidently near the microphone, still waiting for the reaction she expected. I realized then that my silence unsettled her far more than anger ever could have. She had prepared herself to defend her statement against an emotional response. She had not prepared for calm. As I folded my hands together once more, I understood that the evening had already changed in a way no one could reverse. The celebration was no longer about the words that had been spoken. It was becoming a moment when 40 years of quiet choices would finally be seen through a different light, and for the first time, I felt completely ready to let the truth reveal itself without raising my voice. As the silence continued, I realized something that had taken me nearly 4 decades to understand. A marriage is rarely defined by one dramatic moment. It is shaped by thousands of ordinary choices that nobody else ever sees. Looking around the banquet room, I knew every guest believed they understood our story because they had witnessed birthdays, holidays, graduations, and anniversary dinners. They had seen smiles and family photographs and laughter during neighborhood gatherings. What they had never seen were the quiet decisions made behind closed doors, the compromises accepted without complaint, and the promises kept without expecting recognition. When Victoria and I were newly married, I believed love meant protecting one another from life's burdens whenever possible. That belief guided almost every important decision I made. When my company offered promotions that required relocating across the country, I declined because Victoria wanted to remain close to her parents. My supervisor warned me that refusing those opportunities might slow my career, but I never regretted staying because I thought family came before ambition. Years later, when her father became seriously ill, I used nearly every vacation day I had accumulated so I could help drive him to medical appointments while Victoria managed the rest of the family. I never mentioned those sacrifices because they felt like natural responsibilities rather than extraordinary acts. During difficult financial years, I quietly repaired our roof myself after work instead of hiring contractors. I spent weekends replacing old plumbing, repainting bedrooms, and maintaining our aging house because every dollar we saved could be used for our children's education. I remember standing on a ladder one hot summer afternoon while our daughter studied for college entrance exams inside the house. Sweat covered my face, my hands ached from holding heavy tools, yet I felt grateful because I believed those long hours were helping build a secure future for the people I loved. Looking back, I realized that most acts of devotion never receive applause because they happen when no audience is present. Even after retirement, I continued believing that quiet service was one of the strongest expressions of love. When Victoria underwent knee replacement surgery several years earlier, I became her primary caregiver throughout her recovery. I prepared meals, organized medications, drove her to physical therapy appointments, and learned exercises so I could help her practice safely at home. Friends often complimented her remarkable recovery, but very few realized how many evenings had been spent patiently encouraging her through discomfort and frustration. I never expected anyone to notice, because caring for someone you love should never become a performance. Across the banquet room, I noticed several longtime friends exchanging thoughtful glances. Some of them had known fragments of these memories because they had lived nearby. Others were quietly remembering occasions when they had called me for help repairing a fence, moving heavy furniture, or assisting during emergencies, knowing I would come without hesitation. None of those moments had ever seemed important enough to mention publicly. They were simply part of the life I believed a husband, father, friend, and neighbor should live. As those memories returned, my smile became easier to hold. It was no longer protecting me from embarrassment. It reflected the peace that comes when you understand your character is built by years of consistent actions rather than a single accusation spoken into a microphone. I slowly looked toward Victoria once again. She remained standing near the stage, waiting for me to defend myself against her words. Instead, I quietly stood from my chair and straightened my suit jacket. The room immediately became silent again as every guest turned toward me. They expected an argument. They expected years of hidden resentment to explode into the open. But after carrying 40 years of quiet responsibilities, I had learned that truth rarely needs volume to become convincing. It only needs the opportunity to be heard. I stood slowly, adjusted my jacket, and looked around the room before taking a single step toward the stage. Nobody spoke. Even the musicians in the corner quietly lowered their instruments as every guest waited to see what would happen next. Victoria remained beside the microphone with her arms folded, her expression calm but firm. She seemed convinced that I was finally about to defend myself, and perhaps that was exactly what everyone expected. As I reached the front of the room, I smiled politely at the master of ceremonies and asked if I might borrow the microphone for just a few minutes. He handed it to me without hesitation. I thanked him, turned toward the audience, and took a slow breath. Before I say anything else, I began, I want to thank every one of you for spending your evening with us. Seeing so many people who have shared different chapters of our lives is something I will always appreciate. The room remained perfectly still. I noticed our daughter quietly wiping away tears while our son leaned forward in his chair, listening more carefully than he ever had before. I continued speaking in the same calm voice. Many of you have known us for years. Some have known us since we were newly married. Others met us through work, church, school, or the neighborhood. Each of you has seen a different part of our journey. I paused briefly before continuing. Tonight you heard a sentence that surprised all of us. I will not argue about how another person feels because every individual has the right to speak honestly about their own emotions. What I can do is share the life I remember living. Several guests nodded quietly. Nobody interrupted. I remember two young people who began their marriage with more hope than money. I remember painting our first apartment together and dreaming about the family we wanted to build. I remember holding each of our children for the first time and promising myself that they would always feel safe inside our home. I remember every ordinary day that slowly became 40 years. My words were not dramatic. They were simply true. I never looked directly at Victoria because this speech was not about proving her wrong. It was about refusing to let one painful sentence become the only version of our history. I continued. I also remember mistakes. I have made many. I worked too many late evenings. I sometimes brought stress home after difficult projects. There were birthdays when I arrived late because of construction deadlines. There were anniversaries that deserved more attention than I gave them. I have never claimed to be a perfect husband. The honesty seemed to surprise several people. They had expected either complete denial or anger. Instead, they heard accountability. But there is one thing I have never regretted, I said softly. Every decision I made was guided by the belief that my family deserved security, opportunity, and stability. Whether those choices were always understood is another question entirely. I could see longtime friends exchanging thoughtful glances. They remembered those years. They remembered the long hours, the difficult projects, and the sacrifices that came with them. Victoria remained silent beside the stage. Her confident posture had begun to soften, although she still said nothing. I looked across the audience one final time before adding, "Tonight is supposed to celebrate 40 years. 40 years cannot be summarized by one sentence, whether that sentence is kind or painful. They deserve honesty. They deserve balance. Most of all, they deserve perspective." I lowered the microphone slightly as the room remained completely silent. It was not an uncomfortable silence anymore. It was the silence of people carefully reconsidering everything they thought they knew about our marriage. And for the first time that evening, I realized I no longer needed anyone to defend me because the truth was already beginning to speak through the memories shared by everyone who had witnessed our lives over the past 4 decades. I paused for a moment after lowering the microphone, not because I had run out of words, but because I wanted everyone to absorb what had already been said. The room remained remarkably quiet. It was no longer the uncomfortable silence that followed Victoria's shocking statement. It had become the thoughtful silence of people comparing what they had just heard with everything they personally remembered about our lives. I looked around and recognized faces that had witnessed different seasons of our marriage. Some had known us as young parents. Others had worked beside me for decades. A few had become close friends only after retirement. Each of them carried a different piece of our story, and together those pieces formed something much larger than a single painful sentence. I smiled gently before continuing. "There is something I have always believed," I said. "A marriage is not measured by the happiest photograph or the hardest conversation. It is measured by what two people choose to do on ordinary days when nobody is watching." Several heads nodded. My longtime friend Robert slowly stood from his chair without anyone inviting him. We had worked together on construction projects for more than 20 years before retiring. He looked toward the audience before speaking. "I probably should not interrupt," he said with a small smile, "but I think everyone deserves to know something." He turned toward me. There were countless mornings when Ethan arrived at work after already helping one of his children with a school project or driving a family member to an appointment. He never complained. He never asked for sympathy. He simply did what needed to be done. Robert sat down again, but before the room could settle, another familiar voice spoke from a nearby table. It belonged to my former supervisor. He explained how I had declined several promotions because accepting them would have required moving hundreds of miles away from our extended family. I remember telling Ethan that turning those opportunities down would cost him financially, he said. His answer never changed. He always said that his family mattered more than a bigger office. I had completely forgotten that conversation until hearing it repeated years later. One memory after another began surfacing naturally throughout the room. A neighbor recalled how I quietly shoveled snow from the driveways of elderly residents before leaving for work each winter. Another friend remembered the weekends I spent helping young families repair storm damage after severe weather instead of relaxing at home. None of those stories had anything to do with proving someone wrong. They simply reflected the way I had tried to live my life. As people continued speaking, I noticed Victoria's expression gradually changing. She was no longer standing with quiet confidence. Instead, she listened carefully as memories accumulated from people who had no reason to exaggerate or take sides. Our daughter slowly reached for her mother's hand, but Victoria remained focused on the voices filling the room. Then our son surprised everyone by standing. His voice was steady, although clearly emotional. "Growing up," he said, "I always thought Dad was simply busy because of work. I never understood how many opportunities he gave up so that our family could stay together. I only learned some of those stories after becoming a father myself." He looked directly at me before adding, "I wish I had thanked you sooner." Those words meant more to me than I could explain. I had never wanted my children to feel indebted to me. I had only hoped they would one day understand why certain choices had been made. I looked back toward the audience and quietly said, "Thank you. But tonight is not about proving that I was always right. None of us are. Every marriage contains mistakes, disappointments, misunderstandings, and seasons that test our patience. What matters is whether we allow one painful moment to erase an entire lifetime." As I finished speaking, I gently folded the speech I had carried in my jacket pocket but never needed to read. The truth had not required carefully prepared words. It had revealed itself through the honest memories of people who had quietly witnessed our lives for 40 years, and I sensed that before the evening ended, An even more important conversation was still waiting to happen. After I folded the unused speech and placed it back inside my jacket, the room remained silent for several long seconds. It was the kind of silence that appears only when people begin seeing familiar memories from an entirely different perspective. No one seemed interested in returning to dinner or dessert anymore. The evening had become something much deeper than an anniversary celebration. It had become an honest reflection on the lives we had actually lived. I stepped away from the microphone, believing I had said everything that needed to be said. Before I could return to my seat, another voice spoke from the back of the room. It belonged to Linda, a retired school principal whose husband and I had volunteered together for many years. She smiled warmly before addressing everyone. "I hope nobody minds if I share one more memory," she said. Without waiting for an answer, she continued. "Several winters ago, our community center lost part of its roof after a severe storm. Ethan arrived every Saturday morning for nearly 2 months. He never wanted recognition. He simply brought his tools, worked alongside volunteers, and quietly went home when the day was finished. Most people here probably never knew he was one of the reasons that building reopened on schedule." I had almost forgotten about those weekends until she mentioned them. They had never seemed important enough to remember because helping had simply felt natural. Her story was followed by another. A longtime neighbor described how I had quietly driven him to medical appointments after his eyesight began failing. Someone else remembered that I organized a neighborhood fund to help a young family rebuild after a house fire. None of those stories had anything to do with our marriage directly, yet together they painted a picture of the values that had guided my life. I never interrupted anyone because their memories belonged to them just as much as they belonged to me. While they spoke, I glanced toward Victoria. She no longer looked at me with frustration or certainty. Instead, she seemed overwhelmed by the realization that everyone else had experienced a version of me very different from the one she had described only minutes earlier. Our daughter slowly walked toward the stage and gently embraced her mother before returning to stand beside me. She whispered, "Dad, I never realized how many people carry pieces of your story." I smiled softly and answered, "Neither did I." Then our youngest grandson raised his hand from his chair as though he were sitting in a classroom. Several guests smiled through their tears. "Grandpa," he asked, "why did you smile when Grandma said those hurtful words?" The entire room became quiet again. Children have a remarkable way of asking the question every adult is silently wondering. I knelt beside him, so we were at the same eye level. "Because sometimes," I said gently, "when someone is carrying pain for a very long time, arguing with them only adds more pain." I smiled because I knew shouting would not help either of us understand each other. I wanted everyone to remember this evening for the truth that followed, not for another argument. He thought about my answer for a moment before nodding slowly. I stood once more and looked around the room. Many guests wiped away tears while others quietly smiled with understanding. It became clear that the evening was no longer divided into sides. People were not choosing one person over another. They were recognizing the difference between reacting to hurt and responding with dignity. As I looked toward Victoria again, I could see that something inside her had begun to change. The confidence she carried when she first spoke into the microphone had disappeared, replaced by thoughtful silence. For the first time that evening, I sensed that she was no longer preparing another accusation. She was beginning to listen, not only to the voices around her, but perhaps also to memories she had not allowed herself to revisit for many years. And somehow, that quiet change felt more meaningful than any argument either of us could have won. The room remained quiet long after the last voice faded. No one rushed back to their conversations. No one reached for dessert. It felt as though every person present understood they had witnessed something far more important than an anniversary toast. I stood beside the stage with my hands resting comfortably in front of me, giving everyone the space to process what had unfolded. Then, for the first time that evening, Victoria slowly reached toward the microphone again. Her movements were hesitant now, nothing like the confidence she had shown only minutes earlier. She looked across the room before finally meeting my eyes. There was no anger in her expression anymore. There was uncertainty, sadness, and something I had not seen in a very long time. Humility. She took a slow breath before speaking. "I did not expect tonight to become this," she said quietly. Her voice no longer carried the certainty that had filled the room with shock earlier. Instead, it sounded almost fragile. "When I planned what I wanted to say, I believed I was finally being honest about feelings I had carried for years. I convinced myself that speaking those words would somehow free me. She paused, glancing briefly toward our children before continuing. Instead, I have listened to memories that reminded me of many things I stopped noticing a long time ago. Nobody interrupted. Even the youngest guests remained unusually still. Victoria continued speaking carefully, choosing every word with far greater thought than before. Somewhere over the years, I began remembering disappointments more clearly than kindness. I focused on the evenings when Ethan came home exhausted instead of remembering why he worked so hard. I remembered lonely moments without giving equal weight to everything those sacrifices made possible for our family. I quietly listened without moving. There was nothing I needed to add. These were words she needed to discover herself. Our daughter slowly wiped tears from her face, while our son lowered his eyes toward the table. Victoria looked at them before continuing. I am not asking anyone to ignore my feelings. There were seasons when I felt alone. There were conversations we should have had, but never did. There were disappointments that became heavier because I allowed them to remain unspoken for too many years. She stopped again before looking directly at me. But tonight I also realized something difficult. I allowed those disappointments to become the entire story in my own mind. They slowly erased memories that deserved just as much space. The honesty in her voice reached every corner of the room. It did not erase what had happened, but it changed the direction of the evening. For the first time, this was no longer about blame. It had become about truth in its fullest form. I smiled gently and nodded, not because every wound had suddenly disappeared, but because genuine reflection deserves respect. Our grandson looked back and forth between us with the quiet curiosity only children possess. Around the room, several guests exchanged understanding smiles instead of uncomfortable glances. The tension that had filled the banquet hall earlier had softened into something calmer. Victoria lowered the microphone and walked a few steps toward me. She stopped before reaching my side, leaving enough space to acknowledge that some distances cannot be crossed in a single moment. I cannot change what I said, she admitted softly, but I wish I had chosen a different way to speak after all these years. I answered just loudly enough for those nearest to hear. Honest conversations should build understanding, not erase a lifetime. She lowered her eyes and quietly nodded. At that moment, I realized that the greatest change was not happening in front of the audience. It was happening inside two people who had finally stopped defending themselves long enough to hear the complete story of their own lives. And somehow, that realization carried more hope than any applause ever could. After several quiet moments, I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and removed a simple cream-colored envelope that had remained there throughout the evening. I held it gently without raising it dramatically because it was never meant to become a performance. I looked toward Victoria before speaking. I brought this tonight before any of us arrived, I said calmly. Not because I expected this conversation, but because I believed our anniversary deserved complete honesty, whatever direction the evening might take. Every guest watched in silence as I extended the envelope toward her. She accepted it with uncertain hands, glancing at me before carefully opening it. Inside was a handwritten letter rather than a legal document or anything designed to embarrass her. She unfolded the pages slowly, and after reading the first few lines, her shoulders relaxed as tears quietly filled her eyes. I gave her all the time she needed because some words should never be rushed. When she finally looked up, I gently explained the reason behind the letter. Several months ago, after retirement gave me more time to think, I realized that both of us had been carrying disappointments we never learned how to discuss honestly. We spent years solving practical problems while quietly ignoring emotional ones. I cannot change the past, but I refuse to spend the rest of my life pretending silence was the same thing as peace. I looked around the room before continuing. That letter is not an accusation. It is not a list of mistakes. It is simply my hope that both of us deserve the freedom to choose our future with honesty instead of obligation. Victoria lowered the pages for a moment and pressed them gently against her heart. She whispered, "You wrote all of this before tonight?" I nodded. "Yes. I wanted to tell you that if we continued our marriage, I hoped we would begin again with truthful conversations instead of old assumptions. And if we discovered we could no longer walk the same road together, then I wanted us to part with respect instead of bitterness. After 40 years, I believed we had earned at least that much dignity. The room remained completely still. Nobody expected those words. They had anticipated revenge, anger, or humiliation. Instead, they witnessed an invitation to honesty. Victoria quietly continued reading the letter. Several times she paused, closed her eyes, and breathed deeply before reading another paragraph. Our daughter gently reached for our son's hand, and together they watched with expressions that mixed sadness and hope. Finally, Victoria folded the letter carefully and looked directly at me. "I spent so many years believing you never understood how lonely I sometimes felt," she said softly. "Reading this makes me realize you understood far more than I allowed myself to believe. I just never gave either of us the chance to have this conversation." I smiled gently. Perhaps neither of us knew how. She nodded slowly. Perhaps. The tension that had defined the evening gradually gave way to something quieter and more genuine. Guests no longer looked uncomfortable. Instead, they seemed grateful to witness two people choosing honesty over pride. One by one, conversations slowly returned throughout the banquet hall, not with excitement, but with warmth. People spoke more softly than before, almost instinctively respecting the importance of what had just happened. I carefully stepped beside Victoria rather than directly in front of her. There was no need for dramatic gestures. The greatest changes rarely happen through grand speeches. They begin with the willingness to listen. As the musicians quietly resumed playing gentle piano melodies in the background, I realized our anniversary had become nothing like the celebration anyone planned. Yet somehow it had become far more meaningful. The evening had stopped being about preserving appearances. It had become about choosing truth with compassion, and regardless of what tomorrow might bring. That felt like the first genuinely hopeful step either of us had taken in many years. 3 months passed after our anniversary, and life became quieter than it had been in many years. That evening did not magically erase 40 years of misunderstandings, nor did it instantly repair every disappointment either of us had carried. Real life rarely works that way. Instead, it gave us something far more valuable. It gave us the courage to stop pretending that silence was the same as understanding. Victoria and I began meeting every Thursday morning at a small coffee shop near the park where we had once taken our children to feed the ducks. We agreed that those mornings were not about defending old decisions or assigning blame. They were simply opportunities to speak honestly without interruptions, assumptions, or resentment. Some conversations were easy. Others were uncomfortable. Yet every meeting ended with more respect than the one before it. For the first time in decades, we listened without preparing our next response. Our children noticed the difference almost immediately. They no longer felt trapped between two people they loved. Instead, they saw parents who were finally learning how to communicate with the maturity that only experience can bring. Our grandchildren returned to seeing family gatherings filled with genuine laughter instead of hidden tension. One Saturday afternoon, my youngest grandson sat beside me on a park bench and asked whether I was happy now. I smiled and answered with complete honesty. Happiness is not the absence of painful memories. It is knowing those memories no longer control your future. He nodded thoughtfully, although I suspected he would not fully understand those words until many years later. Victoria and I ultimately made a decision that surprised many of our friends. We chose not to make any immediate promises about what the future should look like. Instead, we gave ourselves time to rebuild trust one conversation at a time. There was no dramatic announcement. There were no grand public gestures. There was simply two older people choosing honesty after spending too many years settling for assumptions. Looking back now, I realized that my smile on our anniversary was never an act of victory. It was the beginning of freedom. I finally understood that. Another person's opinion could never erase a lifetime of character. Respect earned through decades of consistent choices does not disappear because of one painful sentence spoken during one difficult evening. I also learned something equally important about forgiveness. Forgiveness does not require forgetting. It requires refusing to let bitterness become the final chapter of your story. Victoria later told me that hearing the memories shared by our family and friends forced her to remember parts of our life that had slowly faded beneath years of disappointment. She admitted that pain had narrowed her perspective until it became impossible to see the complete picture. Her honesty deserved the same respect I had hoped my own honesty would receive. That realization allowed both of us to move forward without pretending the past had been perfect. Today, when people ask me about the secret to a long marriage, I no longer speak about endurance or sacrifice alone. I tell them that every relationship eventually reaches a moment when pride becomes more dangerous than any disagreement. If two people can choose truth with kindness before resentment becomes permanent, they still have something worth protecting. And if they discover their paths must eventually separate, they should do so with dignity instead of anger. As I think back to that anniversary evening, I no longer remember the painful sentence that silenced the room. I remember the quiet voices that followed. I remember friends sharing honest memories, children discovering unseen sacrifices, a grandson asking the simplest question, and two people finally choosing to listen after 40 years. In the end, I learned that the strongest response to public humiliation is not revenge. It is a life so consistently honorable that the truth quietly speaks long after every accusation has faded away.